So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point and get my introductory slides up, and we'll get started. It's great to see everybody. I want to just again thank you all for joining. Parker, how does that screen look? We got full screen, or do I need to swap them?
Looks perfect to me.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. I'm just going to adjust my my view here so I can see everybody without problem. Okay, wonderful. Great, and I think we're all settled in. So, gosh, thank you so much to everybody. Excuse me for joining us. I want to just say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where this broadcast may find you. I know we've got folks out west that it's a little earlier for them, so we appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us. We find ourselves already in the third session of this series, and what a wonderful journey it's been. We've got really great lineup here scheduled for today. This is session 3 in our Cultivating Connections in These Changing Times, Walking Together in Kindness, Courage, Endurance, and Love. And this session 3, we have our lead panelist today is Dr. Michael Yellowbird, and he is going to touch on a couple of issues or areas regarding indigenization and neurodecolonization. And we're thrilled to have him as the lead panelist today. And then I know the second hour, Garrett Marin's going to also share some thoughts and some other information. And we really want to encourage you all to use your hand raise feature or the chat box, or to have some interaction too. So just even unmuting and jumping in there with a question or comment. We're going to cover quite a bit today, and there's some really just amazing information that Dr. Yellowbird is going to share with us. I know it blew my mind several times. So really hoping we can get some feedback from all of you. And I also have on the call here, along with our panelists today that you see listed, I have my colleague, Parker Laney. He'll be on with us just to make sure that we get off on the right foot technology-wise. Oh, and there's Jim. Jim, glad you made it. I'm just going to change your name over so nobody gets you and I confused. There we go. I got you. All right. So yeah, we'll just keep an eye open for Dr. Foster, and we'll go from there. Just got a couple introductory slides to share with you, and then I'm going to turn the floor over for an opening blessing, and then we'll turn the floor then over to Dr. Yellowbird. So this event, as many of you know by now, is brought to you by the National American Indian Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. We are located at the University of Iowa, and I'm broadcasting to you today from the College of Public Health here on campus at the university. I'm Steve Steiny. I'm one of the managers here at our center. Oops, and let me just mention too, our ATTC network is made up of 10 regional centers, also a National Hispanic and Latinx Center, as well as an ATTC network coordinating office located at the University of Missouri. This project is supported and funded by SAMHSA. The content of today's presentation does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian Alaska Native ATTC. I will talk with Dr. Yellowbird about making some of the slides he reviews today available in PDF format, and we'll include those in a follow-up email that you will receive within 5 to 7 business days of our broadcast today. And if we can, we'll include those slides. We're also recording this, and we'll make this recording available in our YouTube archive on our Native Center for Behavioral Health website. We can offer that link as well if you don't have that. It's got almost every event that we've done in the past 2.5 years recorded there. It's a great resource if you want to go back and watch maybe a previous broadcast that you weren't able to see or share with a colleague or friend who wasn't able to attend. We'll also offer 2 CEUs for today's broadcasts. You can request those at the time that you receive that follow-up email from our center. And lastly, we'll post a link today to a short survey. We'll also include a link to that survey in the follow-up email. If you could take a few minutes to fill out this brief survey, we would really appreciate hearing back from you. We've added a couple of short answer questions onto this survey, so it gives you a chance to give us some direct feedback in your own words. Any information you provide to us, though, is confidential, can't be linked to you in any way, and is completely private. If you have any questions about that survey or comments or concerns, please reach out to me here, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have. Before we get started and I turn the floor over, I do want to take a few moments. I know we're gathered here virtually today, but we want to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. Please take a moment to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 former members of our team, Ella and Keely Driscoll and Mr. Sean Bear. Thank you. So I want to introduce our panel today. Teresa Sue Brill, Dr. Dan Foster, Jason Butler, Elder June Blue, Yave Bone, Dr. Michael Yellowbird, Mr. Jim Weichel, and Gara Marin. This is a fantastic panel. I'm honored and privileged to be hosting this event for session 3. I want to stop sharing my screen and
I want to just kind of launch into my talk. I don't know, does everyone have a bio on all this, Steve? Do I need to introduce myself any further, or?
I didn't include listed bios.
Okay, let me just say,
yeah.
I'll just briefly say I'm Michael Yellowbird. I'm a member of the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Rickraw from North Dakota. I'm actually in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The lands, the homelands of the Dakota, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, OJ Cree, the Dene people, as well as the homelands of the Métis people. So I'm out of my territory, although I'd like to tease and say, in Canada, this is all used to be all of our Rickraw territory. You guys one time were all part of our people, and they all laugh about that, right? So anyway, I don't want to get too tribal centric here. So I'm like I said, I'm the dean and professor at the University of Manitoba, Faculty of Social Work. And a lot of my work has to do these days with looking at contemplative practices and the power of contemplative practices in regard to some of the traditional teachings, but also a lot has to do with the neuroscience. So I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you. A lot of work. I've really put in a lot of work to put these slides together and to do the research. So hopefully it's you enjoy it and it's meaningful to you. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing the slides that I have. I think I can share. Right there. So you have to let me know if you can see the slides. Yeah. Okay. Great.
All right, we got them. We got them, Doc. Do you want to have it in presentation mode, because we can see your slides on the preview?
Yeah. I was just about to do that. So
okay, great.
Yeah. All right. So this is a presentation that I do for quite a few folks. So you see, learning specialists. This is my oldest daughter. Her name is Arundhati Dirakuka Yellowbird. So her name is in the morning there is peace. It's kind of a name that we have from back home, at least Dirakuka is that. So she's a meditator, and she's 15 now. In this picture, she's probably 11. But ever since she was very little, she would meditate with me. And I want to talk about how indigenous contemplative practices and mindfulness and neurodecolonization are really powerful healing approaches. So I just want to talk briefly about these 5 sort of bullet points here: colonization, decolonization, what happens to the body when it becomes chronically stressed and colonized. What about neuroscience and molecular science findings in the relationship to health and illness, and the traditional indigenous healing practices? What's happening in the brain and body according to Western science when we engage in indigenous healing practices? And how do traditional healing practices create resilient coping in the brain and the body? So spent some time really researching this quite a bit, and found that some really surprising things. This is my grandfather, by the way. His name is Sitting Bear. It's from our tribe, Arikara, hereditary chief. So let me just start with a term that I created, or I conceptualized, called neurodecolonization, which is really about the brain, but also it's about the body and how do we decolonize the brain and the body. And so it's really concerned with not only just oppression, but also the oppression that comes from colonialism and, of course, past generations, right? Intergenerational trauma. What effects do they have on the brain's body, and the brain and the body structure and function, all the way down to these, very, very small levels, like molecular and cellular levels, including epigenetic expression and so on, and our life expectancy and our emotional illness and wellness. Well, there's some really important things that we know about what's happening now when we're stressed and we're traumatized, and we maintain those states. Well, neurodecolonization is not only what happens to the body and brain in the colonial context, but also what kinds of things can we do to help restructure, purify, and decolonize and heal the mind to overcome colonization and oppression? What are the decolonization activities that we need to do in order to facilitate resistance in our bodies and our brains, and create opportunities to continue to do our traditional practices in our present day setting? Again, these are my 2 oldest daughters. When I was a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, which is now it used to be Humboldt State, so they used to come and visit me in my office, and they'd have to sit, and quietly, and so they wouldn't be all charged up when they came to my office. So colonization, I just want to touch on it real quickly, is subjugation of one group by another, right? It's this invasion that happens where intrusion, beliefs, ideas, values, diseases come into some place where indigenous people are, and then settlers come in. And then there's a period of contamination that begins to happen when there's interactions between the groups, right? Harmful and toxic contact can begin to occur, not only like with diseases that killed off millions and millions of indigenous people, but also ideas that are not compatible, even with the social, but also the evolutionary parts of who we are, right? Contamination, for example, could be like introducing indigenous people to refined carbohydrates and sugar, right? And things that we were never used to eating, or to ways that we were never used to living, like we sit a lot, right? And so our movement's been colonized, right? So that's that contamination of of our bodies, and that toxic. So the infection then sets in, when we're toxic for such a period of time, cultures become overwhelmed, sickness and decay and deaths set in, right? There's a diminishment of understanding of who we are, our practices, and the fundamental things that make us, human beings, and that have survived, for millennia, right? So if you survive those first 3 stages of colonization, then those people that survive are the colonized, like us. We pick up the ideas, beliefs, values, and the practices become part of our lives, right? Which is why we have a lot of, depression, a lot of anxiety disorders, a lot of diabetes, chronic health disorders, right? Because we've been colonized in the sense that we no longer are hanging on to our indigenous ideas, beliefs, values, and practices, right? We can function, most of us can function well in a colonial society. A lot of us has made that adaptation, but many people still remain very vulnerable to the structures and the processes of settler society, which is why I mentioned, there's such a high rate of disease and morbidity and death, high mortality among different indigenous groups. Decolonization then, on the flip side of it, is this model that I came up with. The first is like, how do we begin to cleanse ourselves and strip away these harmful practices and thoughts and beliefs and all these different things that have been imposed by colonizing structures, right? So once we begin to do that, which we're always in that state, we move to the state of Renaissance, which is restoration. Restoration of practices, beliefs, and values that were taken away or abandoned during colonization, but they're very relevant for our survival and well-being. And I'll talk about what some of those are. They're very, very common and things that we don't think about. But again, they're, it's part of the Renaissance that we have to go through. The next piece is the Enlightenment period, where we begin to use new ideas, thinking, technologies, and lifestyles that contribute to the advancement and empowerment of Indigenous people. For instance, I have been talking to PhD students and scholars about AI, artificial intelligence. I said, what if you could create an artificially intelligent elder, robotic elder, that would have all the songs, the language, the knowledge, that could, give the best advice, but also could tune into you as an individual, read your body language, maybe sense, any of the pheromones that are coming out, and just really read you really precisely and give you the teachings that you need to teach, right? And this this robotic elder would have, zero biases and would pay attention, right? Would pay attention to you fully, right? So that's kind of one of the things. I'm actually writing a paper on that. I'm sure I'll get creamed by a lot of people that say, we need our elders, we need the human elders. But again, that's one of the ideas that, comes in terms of enlightenment. Is that enlightenment or is that colonization? So there are things we can talk about. So what I've done with the medicine wheel is I have retooled it a bit, and it's got the mind, body, spirit, and emotions in there. But what I've done with it is taking a look at human beings and how the brain processes information and how the body processes information, and understanding the idea behind plasticity in the brain and the body and the cellular and molecular systems. Our cultures, our experiences, and perceptions actually shape our whole body's plasticity. And the plasticity meaning that we can change, and we do change often throughout our lifetimes, right? Our brain changes, our genes change, our cells change, different molecular parts of our body change, increase, decrease, those kinds of things based upon if we're living healthy or if we're under stress, those kinds of things. So things like our human microbiome, all the bacteria that we have in our guts change frequently when we change our diet. We want to eat a better diet, more traditional diet with a lot of fiber, and we get off sugar. We get off of things, alcohol. We stop smoking cigarettes. We start to exercise. All that life, that great circle of life, all these bacteria that there are trillions of bacteria that live inside of us and on us, that really have a very powerful influence on our emotions, right? Our plasticity also changes the expressions of our genes. I'll talk about that. Brain waves, and also they shape specialized brain cells like mirror neurons, which are connected to empathy and understanding and observations of others, as well as neurotransmitters and modulators that either send information or store or keep information, which modulators do. So how do we heal and transform from the diseases of colonialism? And I've come to the conclusion that, like a lot of people say, we discover our ancestral practices. But what are those exactly, right? So the plasticity of our mind and body enables us to return to traditional practices to decolonize trauma and heal the mind and body. So I'll get into a number of those. Before I get to that, I want to talk just a little bit about neuroplasticity. Plasticity is this really big thing, that happens with the brain, where our brain has this ability to change its structure. In terms of structure, when I say structure, it can change neural networks in different parts of our brain. They can increase, they can increase and decrease and so on, according to what we do. Also the function, right? Which parts of the brain function more strongly or less strongly during certain kinds of things, right? And so what we know from a lot of work, that we're not stuck with the brain we're born with. And the brain is kind of like our really major, a center of operation, right? We have this capacity to willfully direct our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, our behavior, so that, different functions of our brain and our body will flower, some will wither. Those ones that we want to, increase can increase because of the plasticity of the brain. Which moral capacities do we want to emerge, right? And which do not? Which emotions flourish and which are stilled, right? So I'll get into that. I know I don't have a lot of time but our cellular and molecular structures and functions in our body also are damaged by the traumas of colonialism. We can also change those too through our own willful direction and lifestyle. And as you'll see, as I talk about a bit more, why that's so important that we are able to change our cellular and molecular structures, and that they can be changed. Excuse me. So neurodecolonization is this concept I created, but it integrates mindfulness approaches or contemplative approaches with indigenous contemplative approaches to change different structures of the brain, right? And what it does is also activate very important neurochemistry in our brain, also neurotransmitters and modulators that improve our epigenetic expression, meaning that we can change our genes so that we live longer, healthier, that we can, I'm sure there's genes that have not been discovered for memory and for language and all those different kinds of things, because culture and genes evolve together. We know that from evolutionary science that our ancestors evolved certain kinds of cultures and practices. Along with that, they evolved the genes to support those cultures and practices and beliefs, which may be a very fundamental reason why a lot of indigenous people are very different than non-indigenous people in a number of ways, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So in the neurodecolonization, the goal is to kind of clip away and delete these neural networks that are problematic, the negative patterns of thought, emotion, behavior, and replace them with healthy, productive structures. And that's, again, very possible to do. Before we get into that, let's talk a bit about colonization, then way down to the molecular level, and things that we didn't know before that we know now that are happening to people. So I also call trauma to be plastic. There's trauma's plastic because it changes. We can kind of get over it, then we can be overcome by it again if we're put into the right conditions or the wrong conditions or whatever. But traumatic plasticity is about this. It's about severe emotional, mental, and physical distress that is caused by these overwhelming negative experiences, right? Molecular colonization is about this traumatic decay or destruction that happens at the molecular level. If you see this picture, you'll see that happening in the DNA there in this. And what we see is that the smallest units can be affected, by trauma, by long-term colonization, by long-term oppression, right? Things like starvation, racism, long-term changes in diet, oppression, those kinds of things can all begin to affect our molecular systems. Things like, the banning of indigenous people's sacred, ceremonial practices, where Teller says in 1882, he called them heathenist dances and ceremonies had to come to an end because they hindered civilization, right? So many of the ceremonies that indigenous people did were attacked by the United States, where a lot of them were contemplative practices. Here you see, of course, the wholesale kidnapping of Native American children, putting them in boarding schools, forcing them to assimilate. And this is really a way that the government could guarantee that these generations didn't have this spiritual strength or this centerpiece that would keep them resilient, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and physically, right? And of course, they wouldn't remember their traditional healing practices. So if we start to talk about what happens then after we're exposed to that kind of trauma and that chronic stress, then we get into what I call enzymatic colonization. The enzymes in our bodies can help lead to colonization. And this particular picture here, let me see if anyone have. Looking for my laser pointer. Yeah, go back here. forget about that. Anyway, I hope you can see my arrow here. So when research has shown that when there's a lot of chronic stress in our lives, and chronic stress can be from, a current trauma, but we can also be carrying genetic variants that increase that chronic stress and that trauma. And I'll talk a little bit about those too as well. What happens is the brain goes into this state of decay, right? And what happens then is you become more vulnerable, right? So this chronic stress chemicals, something called protein kinase C, begins to flood the brain. That's why I call it enzymatic colonization. And it begins to break down these little dendritic spines here, like this little spine here. Each one of these spines, there's a receptor. And in normal times, these spines are stable. And as you learn more information, for instance, you have more sensory experience and learning experiences, you grow a new spine here, right? So at adolescence, you grow a new spine for maybe a jump rope or something. By the time early adulthood rolled around, you stopped jumping rope. And by the time you're an adult or you're an elder, you no longer had that sensory spine there for jumping rope, right? It's just a simplification of it. Let's say, for instance, you had language, postnatal, born, you listen to the language and then you begin to become more fluent in your language. And this is the formed spine there for that, takes up the sensory experience of the learning of language. You carry it on to adulthood, early adulthood, into elder state. So that's kind of really how this works. This dendritic spine works. It's very important, because it's located in the prefrontal cortex of our brains, and it really helps with our sensory experience, and our learning, right? The deprivation of sensory experience, as it says, prevents spine pruning, which means that we're not growing new spines as we learn new information, and we hang on to old spines that maybe are no longer useful to us when we were children, right? So dendritic spines are associated not only with memory and learning, but they're also associated with this capacity then to kind of have these creative experiences as well too, right? With sensory. We know that there's a difference between the loss of spine density when men and women have a traumatic experience. I'm not sure why that is. I mean, I can hypothesize, but I won't at this point. But we also know that dendritic spines provide cognitive resilience against Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, right? Which is interesting. I wrote a chapter earlier this summer, book chapter about healthy indigenous aging. And as I was looking at the research, I thought, wow, look at the level of Alzheimer's disease and dementias that are climbing dramatically among indigenous people that live in Western industrialized society, like Turtle Island. It's scary how quickly they're climbing. And a lot of people equate that to a particular gene called the APOE4 gene, which is associated with Alzheimer's disease. But now people are kind of taking a second look at that. We know that in the rainforest, when you run across tribes like the Chimene Indians that have the same number of the APO4 gene that should make them vulnerable to Alzheimer's, when they're older, they don't get Alzheimer's. In fact, they don't suffer from depression or anxiety disorders. They are people that are known to have the healthiest brains in the world. So if you look at the Chimene Indians of the Bolivian rainforest, the healthiest brains and hearts in the world. And a lot of it could be that, they live a very traditional lifestyle. And when I talk about traditional, I'm not just talking about, some of the things we do. I'm talking about, sleeping on the ground, going without food, having a really heavy plant-based diet with just some protein, meat proteins, but a lot of plant proteins, not drinking sugar or eating sugar or any of those kinds of things. So that's what dendritic spines do. And again, it's concerning because chronic stress then can begin to eliminate those and, of course, make us vulnerable to those diseases. So that's enzymatic colonization. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in some of the research that I've been looking at is that there's this particular concept called microchimera, which is when babies' cells can move through into mom's bloodstream when the baby's still in the womb, right? And they can move throughout the body, mom's body, to all the way until they make it to the brain, right? So this particular study looked at, fetal cells that were, all in a mom's brain, these mothers' brains in this study, all these women over the 70s and over who had died, they were looking at them for Alzheimer's, and they found over half of the women had male DNA in their brains and the cells in their brains that came from their sons, when the sons were in the womb, right? And, what they were also determining was that the cells were still alive and the cells were still communicating with mom cells. For instance, baby cells could be telling mom, and this is what the evolutionary scientists say, it's an evolutionary survival mechanism where babies' cells are saying to mom, pick me up, I'm afraid, love me, cover me up, feed me. All those kind of things that, we think mom just has the instinct for that, could be part of, the instinct or the love or whatever. But the other part of it could be a very interesting and clever evolutionary benefit that we have. So baby cells make it to mom's brain and tell mom, take care of me, right? So mom doesn't abandon the baby, not like, amphibians do or other species do, right? So the other thing they found in this study was that mothers who had had a heart event, maybe had a heart attack or at some point, the baby's cells went to the site of the injury on the heart and began to patch it up. And in some cases, some of the cells even had the capacity, these were specialized cells, to start the heart beating again. It's like giving mom a jolt of electricity, right? So if you think about that, and these cells are very active in mom's brain, what happens then when you think about all these kids that were taken away from their mothers, and the cells, baby cells were still talking to mom's brain saying, pick me up, feed me, I'm afraid, protect me, right? Imagine how much stress and chronic stress was happening in mom's brain at that point when we understand this microtremera phenomenon that's happening, right? Very interesting, because we think about, the trauma that happened, but now we have even more evidence that this probably, went to a very, very deep molecular level of trauma, right? Same thing with the telomere at the end of the chromosome, another molecular structure that exists at the end of the chromosome, which is really important because it helps protect our genetic data, but also it's an indicator of our wellness and our youth. This is kind of the grandson, telomeres there. You see along in the chromosome, grandson chromosome, and his is grandpa chromosome, which is a bit kind of ageist. I'll admit right away it's ageist, and it's also deceptive, because grandpa and grandma can have very long chromosomes if they live a particular kind of way, a healthy way, right? Eating the right diet, exercising, sleeping well, not smoking, laughing, being around people, a lot of things that we call traditional culture, right? And what we know is that every time our cells divide, our telomeres get shorter. And that, happens because we age. But chronic stress also does the same thing. It shortens our telomeres more quickly. And when our cells get too short, they can no longer divide. They become senescent. So they're just sort of hanging out in our bodies, right? And that's not a good thing, because our body's supposed to be able to kind of take care of those. Apoptosis is when the body sort of eats them up or cleans them up. If we're staying healthy, we're not smoking, we're eating a good diet, we're fasting, and we're being hungry for long periods of time, challenging ourselves, our body in different kinds of ways, our telomeres will be much longer, right? But if we overdo that and things like cortisol, which is an adrenaline factor, go up and stay up, then our telomeres will get shorter. So we have to, there's a good balance there, right? Anyway, the idea that these need to stay long and they can stay long into old age is a good thing. They get shorter, that's not such a good thing. So we know how stress, depression, and telomeres all come together, right? Middle-aged people who are physically active, running and moving and swimming and getting their heart rates up, not only had higher aerobic capacities, but also longer telomeres than people who are not active. And they were similar to people who are much younger. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of decolonizing, molecular decolonization, meaning that we can decolonize those telomeres at the end of the chromosomes if we engage in traditional practices, right? In this other study, this is the power of chronic stress, right? In chronic stress, it showed that, both depressed and healthy participants who had chronic stress in their lives, had shorter telomeres. They got shorter, right? And many of the people that were in this study who were depressed, also exhibited cortisol dysregulation. Cortisol is like fight or flight, constantly thinking about that thing, dreaming about that thing, overeating to kind of try to compensate for it, or gossiping to compensate for it, or doing things, or taking drugs or whatever it is, anything that kind of stimulates the brain, and raises the level of dopamine, which is kind of the reward chemical, right? Cigarette will do that. Eating a piece of pizza will do that. Drug, sex, and rock and roll will all raise our levels of dopamine, right? Unless we kind of reach a real low level of depression. So depression, along with chronic stress, even though you're healthy, can shorten your telomere, right? But also the cortisol dysregulation can shorten them even quicker. For children, I always found this to be a really interesting slide and research. Again, you probably would figure this, that kids in the most stressful home have telomeres that are shorter, right? And also neurotransmitters that heighten the effect of that stress, like norepinephrine, for example, the alertness one, and also cortisol, right? Fight or flight, any of those kinds of adrenaline-like factors. This particular study looked at children living in the most stressful environments and homes and communities had telomeres on the average that were 40% shorter than kids that were living in the most secure, loving, nurturing environments. That's interesting when you think about it. There's a lot of marginalized kids, whether they're Black kids, Hispanic kids, indigenous children, that live in these very challenging situations. And before, we had no idea what was going on them at the molecular level in terms of colonization. Now we know that, when there's feelings of unsafety, they're not eating well, they're not loved, they're under stress, those kinds of things are going to shorten their telomeres much more than their counterparts that are living in really loving environments. So in other words, we look at that and say, wow, what's the impact of that? Well, the impact is that these children are becoming aged long before their time, like little old people, right? And again, I don't say that with a sense of ageism. I'm thinking about how quick, the telomeres can shorten. And once telomeres are shortened, that opens us up to more cancers, diabetes, metabolic things like obesity, heart disease, tumors, all those kinds of things that we get more vulnerable to as we age, right? So that's the idea. Now we know a bit about what's happening with kids. We know this too, that with moms, as you mentioned before, with the microchimera slide, that moms have very, very close relationships with their babies, not only emotionally and psychologically, but biologically. Mothers can pass on shorter telomeres to their kids. That happened with my mother. I did my mom's 23andMe genetic test, and then I sent it out to another provider. Then I did mine because I write about the topic, and it was really interesting that my mom had several shortened telomeres, and she passed on a number of them to me. Right. My mom lived to be age 94, but she kind of drug herself across the finish line for many years because she had diabetes for over 50 years, and she had all kinds of pills she took every day. And she was, overweight when she gave birth to many of us because of her diabetes. But the research says this. Elizabeth Blackburn is the Nobel Prize winner, I think in 2015 or 16 on telomeres. But she said, mothers that are exposed to life factors that are really harsh and difficult life factors shorten their telomeres and they pass them on to their kids. What are some of the factors? Well, we know that, Indigenous women face hate crimes, missing and murdered Indigenous women, abuse, poverty, isolation, violence, mocking, culture and your female identity, ridicule, exclusion, stereotyping, sex trafficking, all these different kinds of things, these memes and these tropes of hate, like the Indian princess, the squaw drudge. It reminds me, I was watching Donald Trump announcing his candidacy was it yesterday, and how he was referring to Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas, right? You think about that. It's a hate crime, and of course, it has a molecular cost. Molecular colonization of the brain, the bullied brain, happens when it affects our brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And what is BDNF? Brain-derived neurotrophic factors is proteins that are produced in the brain. They're very important proteins, right? And they become the factors. And what they do is they promote neuron growth. So more neurons, smarter person, more neurons, to use, right, in different kinds of ways. And neurons, are being born, right? And it stops neurons from dying, which is very good, because as we age or we smoke or we don't eat a healthy diet or we're under stress, a lot of our neurons die and we have this kind of decline. And you'll see a slide coming along what happens, to, for example, gray matter in the brain. Bullying in the brain. This is a slide I've enjoyed using because it shows what happens when this big white mouse is bullying this smaller indigenous mouse, or no, I'm sorry, brown mouse, and creating this social stress for the smaller mouse, right? As the stress is increased, the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, rises in the brain, which is good because it's protecting the brain cells. It's protecting and it's helping new brain cells grow. But the prolonged stress of the bullying also activates genes in the front part of the brain that are associated with social anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. So we kind of have an idea now what's happening when we see people that are bullied and they start exhibiting social anxiety, withdrawal, depression, and so on, right? The studies show that BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and its signaling also can participate in this what they call pathophysiology of depression and suicidal behavior. So you've got high levels of social anxiety, withdrawal, and depression going on, BDNF going up, right? And you've got also all the other chemicals that are going up, like cortisol, norepinephrine, those ones. All these signaling that's going on together leads to this depression. And of course, now we know about suicidal behavior. So this may be why a lot of indigenous people, youth, may be more vulnerable to suicide because of society's bullying of their identity, of them personally, or them being afraid of seeing other people being bullied, or this world where they see, they don't have a stable kind of base or community to rely upon, right? So what does BDNF do for us, right? It's really important in terms of our long-term memory, our higher order thinking, right? Thinking creatively about things and beyond, getting ourselves out of that area and really thinking, creatively about a number of things, but also analytically. It really improves our analytical learning, right? Higher analytical learning helps us figure out, different kinds of complex things like learning ceremonies, learning new kinds of behaviors or different kinds of ways, or any kind of thing that requires a higher level of order learning, right? It's called, BDNF is called Miracle Grow for the Brain by this John Rady, who wrote this book called Spark, who talks about exercise science and why movement is so important for BDNF. But as I mentioned before, it helps develop new connections in our brain, which is very important. Helps repair failing brain cells. Those that are not completely dead, BDNF can kind of go in there and like Miracle Grow and start to help them, repair, and also protects our healthy brain cells. So it's critical. And how do we get that, right? Let's look at grandma here. She's out on the road being a traditional person. I always tell people, I said, to me, the most traditional thing you can do is move and walk and run. Probably the next traditional thing is your diet. The next traditional thing is probably language. And the next traditional thing are probably social relationships, and then ceremony and that stuff all comes later. But the most critical thing, I think, for us is that movement, right? So how do we increase the BDNF? Well, we exercise, we move a lot every day, just like our ancestors did. Our ancestors probably took anywhere from 18,000 to 25,000 steps a day. So that's like 9 to 10 miles a day they walked, men and women. And part of that where they would run and they would sprint for periods of time. We know the importance of that. was no such thing as exercise, but now we call it exercise. Avoiding sugar, critical. It's toxic in the first place, but for indigenous people, sugar is particularly bad. Any kind of refined, processed carbohydrate is probably one of the most colonized, one of the biggest things, or biggest colonizations of the mind and the body. Fasting and critical. If we were living like our ancestors, we would be fasting, most of the time. We'd be practicing calorie restriction, only eating so many calories. We'd be intermittently fasting all day, eating maybe only within a 6-hour window, and fasting the rest of the 18 or 19 or 20 hours, the rest of the day, while at the same time moving, right? We don't do that much, right? And we have a lot of metabolic problems with that, including obesity, high blood pressure, and so on. Mental stimulation, the greatest mental stimulation that happens is using your mind's own creativity. Let's say you're in ceremony, you're creatively thinking about, healing and those kinds of things. But other mental stimulation, just for the real part of the world that our ancestors lived in, is they would walk through like behind grandma there, they'd be walking and stepping over sagebrush, looking out for snakes and watching out for holes in the ground, watching out for, hornets or tarantulas or whatever it was, or walking through woods or up mountains, whatever it was. And that kind of mental stimulation is what we were geared to do. That's part of our brain's plasticity, to see things, to smell things, to hear things, to taste things, to touch things in those ways which mentally stimulates the brain. We don't do much of that anymore, which is why we have a lot of disease and illness, and why we don't have the resilience. Sleeping well, sleeping is a major issue. Eating fatty fish or buffalo or elk or any wild food that has omega-3 fatty acids, helps build the brain and helps reduce inflammation in the body. Eating anti-inflammatory foods. Turmeric is not something we ate before, but any spice that's anti-inflammatory. Blueberries. There's a lot of things that indigenous people ate. All kinds of berries and different kinds of roots and things that could that had this anti-inflammatory effect. Mild bioenergetic stress. Very, very traditional, folks. Very, very traditional. Why? Because our people put themselves into the state quite a bit. They couldn't turn on the hot water and take a hot shower. They could not regulate a heater. They had to deal with whatever wood they had, and they had to bundle up. And so their bodies got used to being at a lower set point of temperature, which is why a lot of people can't sleep well today. It's because they get overheated. They don't sleep on top of the covers until they get real cool, and then they cover up later. So the mild bioenergetic stress, if you're sitting in a really hot sauna, different kinds of really cold showers, or being in cold water, or sitting in a sweat lodge is helpful, but it's not enough, right? It's good for your spiritual part, but it's not good it's not enough for the body and the biology and the physiology of the body in order to benefit and to raise the BDNF in the brain, which protects the brain and helps the failing brain cells and creates new ones, right? We know that's what BDNF is. The other thing that's really important is meditation, contemplative practice, mindfulness, which people did all the time. You could look at grandma here and say, what's she thinking about? Is she thinking about going to the store? Is she thinking about weaving? Is she thinking about her grandkids? Now grandma's probably just thinking about, like, here's the road, I'm on the road. Maybe she's singing a prayer song, which a lot of tribes did when they had running societies. They'd run and sing prayer songs and feel the land under them, feel the wind in their face. They would remind them that's a meditation, that's a contemplative practice. Probiotics, probiotic foods, fermented kinds of things are very important. If we're decolonizing the mind, there are a lot of traditional healing practices, as I talked about before. There's some that I found in the research and the literature that I thought, well, this is stuff that's also very, very, very normal for indigenous groups, right? We're meant to move. So running, dancing, and singing are critical. Sleep, I mentioned before. Laughter and humor, I'll cover a little bit about that in just a minute. Collectivism, intermittent fasting, meditation, adaptive stress, and being outside. So again, this is the effects of running or movement, right, on wellness. We evolved to move and run. Running is our heritage. It's no surprise to me why there's so much, vulnerability to anxiety disorders and depression, those kinds of things. Our ancestors are pretty tough. I mean, they put up with a lot of stuff: starvation, climate change, war. There's a lot of uncertainty in their lives. I mean, if you lived in this part of the country, it was cold. If you lived way down south, there was a lot of heat, wild predators, animals, different kinds of things that made them very resilient, right? And running to those things and away from those things was really a big part of our heritage. So we had to use persistence running, where we ran down our food. We just couldn't go to the store and pick up, a steak or something. We had to run down our food, or we had to walk and go fish, or we had to walk and hunt and gather, right? Running and movement, getting our heart rates up, improves our physical fitness, our mental health, and our brain's working memory. It also improves our brain's executive function in the prefrontal cortex, which gives us an ability to delay gratification, avoid distraction, and improve cognitive flexibility, moving from one cognitive task to the next without getting tripped up, right? But that's the ability to stay focused. That's something that's very difficult for many of us that live with cell phones and live in a Western industrialized society where there are all kinds of distractions happening all the time. Even a plane flying over, can be a distraction. We don't think about it much because everything else is so big. Running, moving, swimming, bicycling, although our ancestors didn't have bicycles, increases BDNF. It also increases long-term potentiation, where the neurons that are firing to do the running, to do the breathing, to do the sweating, all fire together, and they get stronger and stronger and bigger, right? They wire together. The last bullet point is that regular endurance exercise really is important. Why? Because it causes this changes in the kynurenine metabolism that protects us from depression, by increased skeletal muscle kynurenine aminotransferase, CAT, right? So when we start exercising, we increase CAT, which shifts away our metabolism away from this neurotoxic kynurenine, KYN, which is really a production of sitting on our butts and not moving and exercising 3 or 4 hours a day. Our ancestors probably did that and more when food was scarce, a lot of times, or they were in the gardens all the time. But even gardening is very new. It's only about 5,000 years old, So we were like this guy. We're constantly moving, men and women moving, following the animals, following the herds. We still have all those genes in our body. And this is why regular endurance exercise can protect us from depression, right? It produces this kynureninic acid, right? But when we sit, when we're colonized to sit and not move, it's no wonder we're going to get depression and anxiety disorders, and then suicide, and then have all these other chronic health disorders. Dancing, critical. Our people dance all the time. Every day, every night, they dance. They've found a reason to dance, right? Birthdays, celebrations, weddings, feasts, death, life, war dance, whatever it was, they dance. This particular study, which isn't real old, as you can see, showed that there's an increase in what endocannabinoid concentrations in the brain, right? So what happens is that dancing increases endocannabinoids, and improves mood. Cycling does the same with a different set of endocannabinoids, right? The most positive beneficial activity in this particular study was singing, right? Think of all the songs that, our people used to sing for all different occasions, just like dancing. So now we know that when we move down to the last paragraph here, we know that there's biochemical evidence of these endocannabinoid, opiates concentrations increasing. And as they increase, that signaling improves the mood, our mood, reduces our stress and anxiety, enhances our memory. Look at this, protects brain function. No wonder that we have so much rise of dementias and Alzheimer's among Indigenous people. They don't dance anymore. They don't sing anymore, right? Their brains are not protected by these endocannabinoids. Humor, very, very similar. Humor also increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And its differences look like they're down to DNA, right? This particular study done by Joan Chiao back in 2009, which has been replicated, more has been written about this. People that with the short alleles means the genetic variance on a gene with this particular gene, it's called the serotonin transporter gene, 5-HTT-LPR. People who have the short alleles on it, let's say they have two CC copies. The people that have the TT copies are the people that are not going to smile. They're going to be very serious kind of people. If you've got a C and a T copy variant on that gene, that means you're kind of a half funny person, right? And you've got a half a funny bone. But if you've got two CC copies, you're going to be a funny Indian. You're going to be a funny bone person, right? And you'll notice that because you'll be a person that's easily moved to laughter and smiling and teasing and so on, right? People with long alleles are the opposite, right? So what this research says is that people with the short alleles, I call them the funny bone gene, right? Flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of teasing, laughter, pranking, funny storytelling, sacred clowns, all those kinds of things, right? And of course, what's happening is something very important. We'll look at that in just the neurochemistry side of that. But people with long alleles are less sensitive to environmental conditions. Yeah, they can take a laugh, or they don't have to have the laugh, right? And they won't suffer. So think about that for a second. All these children that came from residential boarding schools or were sent to residential boarding schools in Turtle Island, probably were people, it was much more likely they had this funny bone gene. And they were not allowed to laugh. If they laughed, they were punished, right? Be serious, right? Whatever it was threatening to the people in the boarding schools, the residential schools, right? So what about that? How am I making this claim? Well, they're collectivist cultures, as you see the last bullet point, are significantly more likely to have, indigenous or people with the funny bone gene, right? The serotonin transporter gene across 29 nations, collectivist cultures. So think about how important laughter is, not only culturally, but if we turn to look at, my uncle Curly here, look at, besides increasing BDNF, what else happens? Science shows it improves memory and learning, which also is protecting the brain, right? No Alzheimer's, no dementia. You can reduce that. It lowers the cortisol, which is like fight or flight, right? Relaxes blood vessels, so it's good for blood pressure. It boosts your immune system through T cells, releases endorphins, and raises, look at that, another protective factor, endocannabinoids, which is why it's so interesting that when you look at indigenous cultures, many of them have societies where there's teasing that's socially sanctioned, funny storytelling, there's sacred clowns, all those kinds of things that we don't really have anymore, right? This is my second youngest daughter, Pachiparino, and she's meditating here. I realize I don't have too much time left, so I'm going to try to speed here a bit. So what about contemplative practices? What we know is that for mindfulness, when we do mindfulness practices, after only 11 hours, we see important changes in the white matter in the brain, the brain part that helps the connectivity of the brain talk between different regions of the brain. After only 11 hours of practice, how about 45 minutes of practice per day for 8 weeks, right? This is a very short time, but you see some significant changes happening in the gray matter. And I'll talk about gray matter in just a second because gray matter is very, very important. But let's think about that. This is very short, 45 minutes of practice per day for 8 weeks, when in fact our ancestors are probably having, up to 3-4 hours a day of really just very, very focused meditative, parts of their lives, right? We know that mindfulness and meditation and contemplative practices also helps decolonize conflict and activates what's called the insula, which is associated with our gut feelings and what's going on inside of us, right? It also controls our mental emotions and our regulation of our body's homeostasis, increases gray matter, which enables one to control negative emotions, right? So if you look at folks that probably have very difficult time controlling their negative emotions, we'll say, well, they were born like that or whatever. And it could be they inherited, anger, because we do inherit some of the emotions from our moms and dads and from other, ancestors. But it also could be that the person has not, had enough growth in their gray matter in their brain. The TPJ, the temporal parietal junction, also becomes activated. And this is a really important part of a junction that in the brain. Well, it's important because it's really associated with emotional intelligence and this ability to mentally sort of read the state of other people. And think about it for a second. If you've got a culture that's meditative, that's doing a lot of laughter, that's sleeping well, that's challenging themselves through mild bioenergetic stress and fasting and moving and all those kinds of things, and plus they have a very contemplative lifestyle, just because they're, of who they are and, their world and their focus, they probably had a high activation of the TPJ in most of the tribal members, right? And they were able to read the mental state of others. Also being able to read the mental state of animals, dogs, horses, deer, elk, moose, whatever, and maybe even read the mental state of flowers, of trees, of grass, right? And these are the people that, shows that increase in that activation in this area probably have that capacity. So there's all these good things that mindfulness does: preserves the brain, reduces activity in the brain's me center, and also rivals depression, antidepressants, and so on. All these changes that happen. Let me just go on to how many hours of meditation. This is my oldest daughter again when she was 2 years old. Remember I showed you she was 11? Well, she's 2 years old. We live in Northern California then. Well, this is what the research shows, that beginners totaling 100 total hours have benefit. So do meditators, have 1,000 hours. Experienced meditators, 5,000 hours of total practice, and lifetime meditators, 10,000 hours. So what happens when you meditate 100 hours? Let's say for 100 days, you're meditating for an hour every day. Well, your neural and hormonal indicators of lessened stress reactivity show that. Your hormonal indicators show that your cortisol levels will go down, right? Your norepinephrine levels go down. There's activation in an anterior cingulate cortex part of the brain up here somewhere, where compassion, you see a lot more activation, and the reactivity of this part of the brain. The amygdala has shrunk down somewhat. Amygdala is kind of in here. Introception, the ability to sense your own internal states. What's going on? Your stomach's churning, something's going on, your heart's beating, you're tuning into your body, to your brain, to your physical body. You get much better at the ability to sense that, right? When you get 1,000 hours of meditation practice, this is a class I had back in 2012. Gosh, it's been 10 years since that time. And when I was a professor in Northern California at Humboldt State University, is my MSW class, where I was teaching mindfulness in the class. Look at this: decreased brain aging up to 7.5 years less compared to baseline. So, and this is up to about 70 years of age that these subjects looked at. So they're almost like about 8 years, less aging in the brain. So meaning that, when they get older, they get 80 years old, their brains are going to be like, 72 years old, right? And so on. And if they have more, their brain will be even younger. There's an increased connectivity between the amygdala, which is the kind of fear, fight or flight part of the brain, which is very important to, and the prefrontal cortex, which is like the planning and the thinking in the rational part of the brain. So you can consciously regulate your emotional, responses, right? So that your amygdala doesn't take off, like what happens with traumatized populations. And that's why meditation is so important for people who've been through trauma. There's a decreased size of the nucleus accumbens, right? The nucleus accumbens part of the brain is like, it's all about me. No, just pay attention to me. I'm the most important person, right? So when we decrease that through meditation and contemplative practices, we then get the feeling it's all about us, which is why contemplative societies and collectivist societies like indigenous people, probably it was so easy to share things, much easier to kind of all go hungry together, right? Because the nucleus accumbens in the brain was shrunk down. It's not about me, it's about all of us. If they're suffering, I'm suffering with them, right? Slower baseline breathing rate, potentially indicating a slow overall metabolic rate, which is good for some people. That's not good for me to have a lower metabolic rate, because mine is low already. So I have to kind of work hard to keep mine, pumped up so I can stay in shape, right? Experienced meditators' brains are much more creative. Why? Because we there's the connections that are being made and all these things that are happening between the connectivity in the brain also increases working memory, problem solutions. People become more adept at that. They're able to stay with the problem that's going on, right? Working memory and draw from previous experience. So let's take a look at 5,000 hours of meditation practice, right? Look at this, the blue in there is the gray matter. Remember I said how important gray matter was. Look at the controls and you'll see that the gray matter in age is very different, right? Let's take a look though on the right side, or left side first. So the first thing is that decreased stress response. Second thing is increased attention and working memory. Okay, we saw that with 1,000 hours. Now it's even greater. There's small improvements in the molecular markers of cellular aging. Remember I said that aging happens in the telomeres at the end of the chromosomes? Well, guess what? We know now that when people are in contemplative situations, right, and they practice mindfulness, plus they do these other kinds of things that are good for the body, the telomeres can actually improve and grow, right? Phenomenal. And also there's a decreased activation in the default mode network, and more, I'll just tell you about that, not late. I'll tell you that now rather than later, is that the default mode network also has to do with the nucleus accumbens, right? But also it has a lot to do with whether or not my mind is focused, right? Right. So my mind is focused, and that is, where we want it to be. When I'm listening to a story, or I'm paying attention to my body or my child or to whoever. The default mode network, can also be a place where the mind is all over the place, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? So let's take a look at the picture now. The blue is gray matter. Look at the controls. How they've, we're looking at the loss, the loss, as we see the loss here, all the blue, all the loss, right? And then we look at meditators. There's the loss compared to controls of gray matter, right? Same thing here. And again, much less gray matter lost, right? Look at that. So gray matter, again, is very important, right? For a number of different reasons. 10,000 hours of practice. I'll finish here. I'm sorry, I apologize to the next speaker. 10,000 hours of practice really is phenomenal. Off the chart synchronized gamma oscillations. Creativity just is huge. Problem solving is huge. Gamma waves, brain waves are also associated with a brain that's maximally sensitive and a brain that is using little or no power. So that brain is in that state, just sort of being there and picking up on all the stuff that's going on around it, right? This is where people say that also people begin to have these paranormal experiences because the brain becomes so sensitive. This is my other girl too here, Solana. So Dati and Banaji and Solana, in this back of our backyard, they're meditating in our backyard. So they don't always do this. I mean, they were very good when they're younger. They're kind of getting a little less, but they still stick with it, which I'm really happy about. So the baseline brain pattern, similar to novice meditators during meditation, they're all kind of meditating at one time. So the patterns are the same, right? But the shrunken, here you go, the shrunken nucleus accumbens organ reduces our ability to identify with self. Very important when you're talking about spirituality. We're talking about, all for one and one for all. Instant voluntary control over pain response. You can see this by some people who have practiced that over and over again, that they can stick a skewer through their arm and immediately the endocannabinoids, boom, just explode. There's no pain in the body, right? All those, sometimes we get a big cut, sometimes the endocannabinoids and all the endorphins rush to that spot and kill the pain. But you don't even have to have that happen. All you gotta do is meditate 10,000 hours. These are people from my tribe back in about 1903. Obviously, their nucleus accumbens are shrunken because it's not about them. It's about, the sacred cedar tree in front of them, the mother, Atna Tawissa, the mother who's come to kind of help the people out, right? They're singing to mother, they're praying with mother, and they're also, something else is happening. They do this for several hours several days, several weeks and months, right? Every day they're out there doing that. It's part of their responsibility. But look at this here. The parietal lobe in the brain is gone offline. It's not like this other side here. Here it's quiet. And that's significant because the parietal lobe is a part of the brain region that is associated with visual spatial reasoning, meaning that they would, when this part was activated and then before they start singing to the tree, you know, when they first started singing to the tree, when they first time they became part of this men's society, the tree was the tree. Yeah, it was sacred, right? But they still weren't experiencing the sacredness of that tree until they spent all that time doing praying with the tree and singing those songs before the parietal lobe would go offline and let them really experience them coming together with the tree, where the distance between the tree and them would disappear, right? They would become the tree. They would become, and the tree would become them. They would become the tree's bark, roots, fragrance, the needles on the tree, everything, right? And this is, now we know, this is taken from studies that were done by a colleague, Andrew Newberg. So I used his slide here, but he's written a book called How God Changes Your Brain. But this has been replicated in neurotheology. How about how Buddhist monks and Tibetan Buddhist monks, Franciscan nuns, are people that really get deep into contemplative states. Right? Same thing here. This guy, a member of our tribe here, we kind of see some of the things that are happening. Changes in the brain wave where he can reach like a gamma wave when he's really highly focused, and he's with all the medicines and singing the songs for several days without food, right? And then the different, beta wave is kind of like maybe the songs he's singing, the alpha wave, maybe getting ready for a real deep meditation, theta wave, sleeping and dreaming, right? And delta wave, of course, is, no dreaming, and so we see all this. Let's see here. Let me just finish with this last two slides. So in creating safe spaces, and also walking together, we should know that, spirituality, it was an asset. It's really helped humans survive. That's kind of, I've looked at, the research and said, wow, and this is let's see here. There's a God spot. There's the God spot in the brain, right? It's not really a God spot. People say it's a God spot, right? One of the things we know, though, is that a key for your well-being is whether you believe in a loving or a God of retribution, right? If you believe in a God that says love everything, love everybody, love that plant, love your children, love those people, love the stars, whatever it is. There's a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex right here, which is about, there's neurons of compassion here. They're about 17 million years old. Down here in the older part of the brain, right? This is the hypothalamus, but also this is the amygdala here. This is about fear. So when you have a fearful God that's going to burn your butt in hell forever, and he's always watching over you, he's got his paper and pencil, so did something else wrong, he's going to burn a little hotter now. This part of the brain activates, right? And you become more closed down to others. You become more closed down to the beauty around you. You're less socially accepting of others. And you are, someone that, has a very difficult time, loving all things and all others, right? I'm not saying that, is true of everyone. I'm just saying generally that's kind of what, the theory is right now. Let's see here. Very last slide. So all the things I've talked about, being in hot places, eating the right foods, sleeping well, taking cold showers, meditating, dancing and singing, all these things not only protect your brain and your molecular structures and decolonize you at that cellular molecular level, they also build resilient coping in the brain in what's called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, right? So here we see the active coping, activation there. Risky coping, there's no activation. We know that prior experience and training how to deal with high levels of uncertainty can improve cognitive resilience, which then goes back to, tribal people indigenous people that had training to teach their children how to deal with hunger, how to deal with the cold, how to deal with uncertainty, and they put them through a lot of training. I don't have time to talk too much about that, but what else is it related to? Well, the VMPFC is not only its location, the prefrontal cortex, under the underside of the brain, but it's also really implicated in the healthy processing of risk and fear. Also plays a role in the inhibition of emotional responses, so that maybe there was something to the Stoic Indian, right? And the process of decision making and self-control, which is critical, right? You couldn't make any kind of just rash decision or not have self-control back in the day for millions of years, right? Our ancestors for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years had to have very rational decision-making and self-control, had to be able to deal with their risk and fear, and had to be able to kind of, inhibit, emotional responses and be tough, right? But it's also, look at the last one, it's also involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality. So if I get time, I'll talk about that later, but I'm going to just apologize because I know I've taken more time than I should have taken. And I'm going to get out of this, and thank you so much.
Now let's Kamati, Dr. Yellowbird. I went ahead and typed an invitation in the chat just to give us a moment to take a few breaths and integrate together, inviting us, those that are willing in the chat, to type in or even say in our voice, what's one practical reinforcement or a lifestyle shift that we can implement into our lives, inspired by Dr. Yellowbird's presentation, those reminders, that encouragement. So we'll be taking some breaths and see what folks would like to lift up with their voice or in the chat.
I have a question, Dr. Yellowbird. So you had mentioned about, this blows my mind. It's like one of those things that you're talking about as the children's cells move within the women. And it's deeper than that, but I have a question about what role do the men play in, I mean, we know our women are so important, and that just like, trying to lift that up, because of the treatment of women. And I think that's very intentional too. But what role do the children play within the men? Anything with the cells or in regards to that? Miigwech.
As far as we know, I mean, men don't contribute as much as women contribute to the children, first of all, right? It's pretty close relationship. Men contribute, to don't get me wrong, wouldn't happen without that. But I don't know of anything other than, genetically, you'll get like half a mom's genes and half a dad's, variants. So if dad was a funny guy and mom was a funny lady, you'd be a very funny kid. Chances are significantly more likely. Now, if dad was a serious guy, we'll make a square, right? And mom was a funny lady, you'd be, chances are you'd be kind of intermediate, right? But so dads contribute that in terms of to children, that kind of genetic material, which in some cases is very different today. Because women don't select men like they used to way, like 20,000 years ago. They don't. They select them on TikTok or whatever it is, or whatever these things are. But before, women had this capacity. I'm trying to remember the name of the talent that they had, but they had the capacity to smell a men's pheromones, and they could smell whether or not a man, probably was carrying, multiple sclerosis, or had genes that would code for cancer, or they would code for, brain tumor or something. Major histocompatibility complex is what it's called. Major histocompatibility complex. So histo is the smell, and compatibility is like, are we compatible, right? So what changed that dramatically was when women started taking birth control pills. Your magic went away. And so you married all these stinky men, right? And when you get off your birth control pill, you say, "Whoa, man, this man stinks," right? But and probably some people would say that's why we have a rise in different kinds of diseases and that kind of thing, right? Because women had the capacity, and colonization, of course, destroyed that capacity, right? So men, as I say, then didn't really, men could, put something into it, but women were kind of, the real seers and the sensors. So very powerful, right? So.
Uh, I I put it in the chat box, but I also wanted to, I guess, express gratitude first, foremost, for sharing the research you've been doing in meditation and reduction of I guess staving off reduction of the telomeres, so that our bodies can produce it for longer. I'm assuming, and I really, really like that you had tied into meditation, and I've been trying to make this connection with everyone that goes through my programs. That we have a practice of singing, and it's singing together, being able to call and response, and being of the same mind and of the same breath. So when we're doing our dances and our ceremony, or we're making prayers together, everyone thinks of the whole of the community or other people, and not specifically within their self, because we are there for the community itself to make those prayers. So our mind is on specific things that people have brought forward to pray about beforehand. And when we sing, you have to listen in, because you don't know what song is going to come out, and the callback is dependent on the person doing the call, and it's supposed to just come to that singer who's doing that first initial response. But I have noticed that there's a feeling within those grounds, or within those songs, I should say, that when we're all singing them, is bar none for anything else in my life. And the people who's experienced it as well, that they feel this immense joy. And I've started to, for the past 3 or 4 years, started to instruct that when we have a hard time or a hard day, that we sing those songs, and not to really care about whatever anybody might have to say about those songs, but to sing them to yourself and to make them audible, because it immerses you within that moment and what you're focusing on. And when you started talking about meditation, it was like a light bulb went off. That's it. That's it. That is a meditation practice. And there's a reason why the people who've been going to Gatio and practicing for their whole life, they feel a certain kind of way when they're with their interactions, and how they speak and how successful they become, because when they speak, it is of intention that is more than just here in this moment. So I just wanted to say thank you and appreciate that. And it was very, very awesome.
It appears that a few folks are still chiming in the chat and sharing in their voice. The integration and the practical transfer, implementation of some of the wisdom and the encouragement that Dr. Yellowbird has transmitted. So inviting us to take a few more breaths and lift anything up that we'd like to, and then I'll offer a little bit of reinforcement and a little bit of the connections in our work here with young people and an attempt to strengthen our solidarity here in Turtle Island with all of you as well.
I wanted to say miigwech to Dr. Michael Yellowbird as well, for sharing all you did and backing our knowledge with that science. And it helps, I believe, our people across the nations across Turtle Island to help implement and the needed changes, diagnoses, treatments, the way we look at it, the plan of what's going on. I love that you showed the truth of the impacts of past and present, but also it doesn't have to be, we can change this and we can turn it around, and how to see what is indicative of. Also the diet, I can't stress that enough. It's one of the first things they took from us was diet, our voice, the women speaking, and diet. And diet can change your mood within moments of what you eat. And it is that impacting, but it is killing us in so many ways. And we have such high rates of it. To try to get back to these diets, cultural based, there's a lot that you can get in the grocery store that is similar to, like salmons, nuts, seeds, the deep greens, things like that. Tunas, all of that is closer to an anti-inflammatory or cultural-based diet. And the exercise, if you can't walk, bend, stoop, there's things you can do it, little steps, but get out there and do it. It's a matter of getting that heart rate up and keeping it up for a little while and learning to breathe through it. The being aware of your surroundings and what being in your moment is so important. Trauma can take that from us. We're often those thoughts, often those memories, viewing the world from that scope. And it takes over our own positive minds, our openness, as we become toxic from the toxicity that was put upon us. So it's important to do the whole of it and see that they're doing the whole of it. And then what is going on currently, because oftentimes our people can do all of these things and be trying just hard, but what they're going to work in is lateral violence. What they're going home to is some dysfunction or abuse in the neighborhood and tribal housing around them or whatnot, maybe mold infested home. And to find out what's going on in that situation, if they have been changing their diet, they are trying to exercise, they are singing, they are doing all their diligence, and they're just they're heart forward, and yet they're still suffering, then to see what is going on in that world around them. Because when you're born into it and it becomes just the world as it is, you don't sometimes think to talk about it or bring it up. So how we can support them in that, finding resources or how to best deal with it. You can't change your neighborhood. You can't cause those families to stop being dysfunctional. So what can they do? And these are all tools that are greatly needed to then support those healthy changes they're making. It's really important. I'm so thankful for Dr. Michael Yellowbird sharing here today. I just wanted to say that and to stress that is a part of your evaluations, the diet, what kind of activity they have in their lifestyle. It doesn't always have to be walking, running. It can be canoeing. It can be bending, stooping, gathering. It can be, swimming. It can be different kind of things, dance, that they're more called to or body able. So what their body is able to do. And working on that. A lot of our injuries in our bodies can be due to trauma, just so many of it, and so then let that be indicative of, as they're working through and finding what they need. And so I'm going to pass with that, but thank you so much, Miigwech.
Hmm.
I have to get off here in a second. But I did want to say, Yawagoa, Michael, this is the second kind of project I've been honored to be a part of with you. And every time I think I know a lot, but every time I just learn so much more. So I want to say Yahweh. And I was thinking, as listening to others or looking at the chat, Teresa mentioned, the environments that we have to navigate, whether they be work, community, home, are not always the most conducive to what we call the good mind or maintaining that good mind or good health. And I was just thinking how these practices, working in this field, we talk a lot about self-care, and a lot of times lip service is given to it, actually. Uh, where I work on our calendar, when you block off time in your calendar, there's actually some you can put self-care there. But what's that mean? Take 15 minutes and go have a cup of coffee away from everybody else or something like that. But really, this should be something for me to strive for, to and if I think it was the first session what we talked about, bringing this into our everyday lives and these cultures isn't necessarily going around teaching it and talking about it to everybody, but practicing it myself. So I was just thinking about these practices are a way to navigate sometimes what is a very toxic environment, or as John Trudell said, protect your spirits, because you're in the place where spirits get eaten. And so this is these practices, various practices, are a way to do that. Yeah, because if I'm not well myself, I'm certainly not going to be able to be of much use to my community. So with that, I have to hop off and run to another meeting. But I really want to say once again, Yahweh, Michael, and to everybody else involved in this.
Nostino Mekayotzin, Inishi Noyolo, with the permission of the ancestors of the land here in Yanaguana, Somisek, Tapilam Coahuilteca Nation, Carrizo Comecrudo. My name is Hera Omar Marin, and I'm honored to be here with you all at the invitation of Jim and Steve and Elder June Blue. And I want to thank you so much, Dr. Yellowbird, for reinforcing a lot of my grandma's teachings. And we've looked towards your research, your books, with Waziyato Win, and the recent chapter you shared with us. And it's been really useful for us as we're looking for ways here in Yanaguana and San Antonio to translate all that wisdom into practices with the young people, movement, dance, farming, agriculture, music. So thank you all for the invitation. I just want to share a few photos with you all and share one small practice in support of us integrating all this wisdom, all this what we call animo. It's like encouragement and love at the same time that we receive from Dr. Yellowbird, honoring in that Moyokoyani, in our Nahuatl language, that wisdom that's already in it, that DNA, that these practices help strengthen and cultivate. So I'm really boosted, my heart's expanded, and so is my mind. Just with more language, more data, and just feeling just so strengthened thanks to this presentation, this opportunity. So I'd like to invite us all just in this transition moment to take 5 breaths, 4 for the 4 directions, 4 elements, and 1 for that great strength of love that's in our hearts. Tlaskamati Naletsam. I greet you as a young Chasqui prayer runner. I'm an educator, I'm an urban farmer, And I'm a son of Mother Earth, Tonantzintlalli, and I recently, just last month, got married to the braided woman of my daydreams and my night dreams, Vanessa Quesada, who is Kickapoo and Mexicana. I'm from the Chihuahua Desert. I go by Hera, in short for Gerardo. I'm mixed blood, Huachichil Chichimeca from the Zacatecas Highlands, Mexico region, Tepehuan on my dad's side, but I also identify as Chicano as a part of my resistance to the white man Hispanicizing us and Latinizing us, and politicize a conscious reclaiming of the indigeneity in my Mexican roots, but I'm also embracing my Spanish and my Ashkenazi roots on my father's side. I got made fun of growing up because they said I had a nopal on my forehead, which was kind of derogatory, which meant I was staying in the past. The nopal is the prickly pear cactus, a great teacher of ours that provides sacred foods and even helps us prevent and heal diabetes. But the internalized oppression was so real in my family, they tried to go so far forward that they saw the past as antiquated and as maybe keeping us behind. Well, thank goodness, after a recent 4 days of ceremonies, of fire vigils, of offerings, of dance, of celebration, of providing food for our families through a deer that I hunted with my father-in-law. My father came around 40 years later and said, hey, I really appreciate what you're doing. That's really tough work. And make sure you also talk about our Chihuahua indigenous side. So there's a great healing in that. And I consider it a big victory for a lot of us that are healing that internalized ism in us. I'd like to share with you all just some photos of some of your all's kin, your all's family, friends here in San Antonio, Yanaguana, just to give a sense for some of the work that we love to do with Sanarte Healing and Cultura Clinic. We provide mobile clinics, bringing traditional medicine, sound healing, food, nutrition, mindfulness meditation, body work, working with the plants, the smoke, the cedar, the copal, the joy, the unity, the theater, the playfulness. Just two different images on the left. Vanessa and I, we train people in a hybrid of physical movement, therapeutic movement to open up the joints, get the blood circulating, strengthen the mind, the brain, and then do some breath work, and then lay down and relax where the body regenerates, the mind stays awake, but it's also suggestible to help us shed the skins, shed those limiting thoughts from the colonization, from feeling not enough, from the self-sabotage. And then we plant those new seeds that we teach people how to also cultivate and water those seeds of self-love, self-determination, and that community care, the community connection. As we work in here community with a lot of environmental justice activists, runners, gardeners, farmers. My wife also works with the midwives, bringing back the indigenous birth work back and the food and nutrition. And I even get to cook for some of that. On the right is with the young people, we also do full presence, Nikan Kap, full presence, mindful drumming, percussion with the ayakashlis, also considered the rattles, the drums, the flutes, the voice, and one of the greatest instruments, our bodies. So I want to invite us to gently tap our chest 7 times, just feeling that percussion instrument that we can also be. Excellent. And I'm gonna see if I can share this. Can everyone see this image? Kiawe, can you see that image? All right, great. So this is a picture of us yesterday at one of the community colleges where we did a workshop on decolonizing, but rehumanizing, right? Also recognizing that we have to do it in practice, right? So we're moving, we're observing mindfully our steps, our breath, our sound, and our thoughts, right? So that we're gonna uproot those unhealthy weeds of that I just mentioned, right? That self-limiting talk, but we prepared them for then doing this. Right, the combination of what I just shared, where Vanessa's guiding them in breath work that's rhythmic, that we also guide with the drum to prepare them for some of that Teomania, that sound healing integration journey. So I share that with you all just to give you a little bit of a sense and offer our solidarity and our unity with you all as we want to complement this great work that we're all doing here and make it even more accessible. So I want to, speaking of access, I want to ask everyone to show a digital hand or physical hand. Does anyone here besides me have a little bit of a challenging time just sitting still for more than like 10-15 minutes? Show a digital hand or a real hand, please. All right, excellent. And so we imagine the young people, right, that we work with, right? And I work with also a lot of parents. We do a lot of theater work with parents role play and the children as well that are at each other kind of throats, and we're trying to help them rebuild trust again, because we don't trust these unjust law systems, these punishment systems. We're really about these restorative approaches. But we recognize that like everyone's stressed out, right? And then sometimes there's an encouragement to like, oh, we'll bring in more mindfulness, right? So we reference my grandma's teachings, my mama Alma's teachings, Dr. Yellowbird's teachings around meditation is not a new thing, right? Right. So we're making it relevant again, right? So that it resonates with us, right? The ways that we do one thing at a time. So show of hands, who here multitasked a little bit today? Who here's done more than one thing at the same time? Checking the phone, listening to this awesome presentation, looking over here, right? So what happens to us, right? Well, my great Chichimeca grandmother, Chabelita, reminded me, she said, do one thing at a time, do it well. And then move on to the next thing. Do one thing at a time, do it well. And you'll have more time later to be playful and to be spontaneous, right? So part of also that decolonization for us is to tune into the breath, focus in on what's really most important. And in between our emotions, in between our movements, activities, tasks, assignments, presentations, to take a little break, recenter, and set an intention for this next moment. So I'm going to guide us here on just a short little practice that we often do. You saw us standing up, we're walking around, we're moving, we're dancing, we're being silly, we're being playful. And then we get down also to business, right? Because sometimes to release some of those things that are stuck in us, right? They've grabbed onto us, right? That some of those oppressors' voice, sometimes we're our own oppressor. It can be tough. So we go through this series, right? So I want to invite us to doing something just gentle and just increase our connection with ourselves, that confidence with ourselves, where the answers are, right? Inside our Moyo Koyani. So inviting us just to gently put our fingertips on top of our shoulders, right? And we're just going to warm up our shoulders and by moving our wings 9 times in one direction while breathing gently in and out through the nose, and intentionally attempting to fill the belly while we're breathing, that diaphragm. We call it the deep fan breath. Relaxing the jaw, staying present and relaxed at the same time. And then we'll aim our elbows up a bit, and then we'll go down the opposite direction. Many of you have reminded us that we may be sitting or standing, we're at these stations, we're typing, we're listening over and over. Right? We're human, so even though we're told in the mornings, wake up, go outside, look at the horizon, touch the cold earth for a moment, we can weave these moments into our day, relaxing the hands. Now I want to invite us to feel our hands on top of our thighs and gently raise our tippy toes, right? And I want us to do toe raises. So my toes are kind of going up and down, and we're engaging the calves, which connects the kidneys a little bit as well, which is connected to our adrenal glands, which can either be fatigued or can be resourced and nourished. So I'm just modeling for you. So I want to invite us again to keep a cool attitude, keep a cool jaw, relaxed jaw and shoulders, and do that a little bit faster while breathing in through the nose. So something subtle for us, right? We're doing these toe raises while we're sitting. Doesn't require that much effort. However, it can start to get us our heart rate pumping a little bit, blood flowing a little bit more. We can begin to shift our vibration, our state, and prepare and prime ourselves for what's most important for us in the moment. Relaxing the feet, rubbing the hands together, noticing the sound, engaging a whole other part of our brain. Dr. Yellowbird talked about the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, noticing the sound. And then bring some of that warmth over our temples while our spine is in that integrous position. It's long. We're breathing in, still filling the belly. And exhale through the mouth. I'd like to invite us to take 3 more breaths together and make a sound on the exhale. It may be a vowel sound, but really let that vibration be soothing for you. Oh. Ooh. One that we love with the young ones is that sound of the heart. Relaxing our hands and just inviting us in curiosity and in awe, these amazing bodies, this existence that we've chosen to step up and collaborate with. Notice just one sensation that's standing out in the body. It may be a texture, maybe a pulsing, maybe a temperature. Without any judgment, just observing it. And knowing that practicing that self-observation increases our connection with ourselves, our ability to respond, to make choices. to take in information, to express ourselves, to communicate from our core. And again, to integrate, inviting us to take 5 breaths again, 4 for the 4 elements and 1 for that strength and unconditional power of love in our hearts. Tlaskamathi, thank you for my bottom of my heart. It's very grounding for me to move with y'all, see you all move and groove and take some breaths together. So thank you for contributing your presence, your essence, your ihi with us, and knowing that we're here in San Antonio, Texas. Tough dynamics here, y'all. We need all the solidarity we can get. This state, a lot of factions are making it illegal for us to teach our true her stories, indigenous histories. But we know that they buried some of our ancestors, but they didn't know that they were seeds. So we're sprouting together. We're finding each other again, like Elder June Blue shared, fulfilling that prophecy of the Condor, Quetzal, Eagle, Kuntur Anka, Warawau, Quetzal, of unity, right? Like I said, we're distant, short distant cousins, so with different gifts and medicines. So we're here in unity with you all, wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day, and sending lots of plasotla, lots of love to your bright, mighty hearts and all of your relatives, your territories, and look forward to continuing to build with you all. Timo Itase, catch you all soon.
We are approaching the top of the hour. Want to just thank, of course, Dr. Michael Yellowbird and Gara for those presentations. And yeah, Gara, I'm coming down to Texas. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll be down there. Well, really fantastic. I want to again just thank the panelists and all of you for staying with us this last couple of hours and to have stayed with us through this 3-session series. This sets the table for us to do this more and more often. So thank you so much for all of the work that the panelists have put into this, as well as the participants. It's been wonderful to see many of you return for each session. So I want to just say thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to work with all of you and be with you. So on that note, I to honor everyone's time commitments, we want to try and stay within the time frame that we advertised. And I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague and friend Kiave Bone to take us out in a good way with a blessing. So again, thank you, everyone. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, stay connected. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. If everyone will just give us just maybe a minute or two here. You can close your eyes if you'd like, but I'm just going to pray in my language because it's what speaks through my heart. Oge dola galala de galang we oge says today to do to go ya he we gonna go ya had near lo he na skia sia so the cast like tea tago jeli o to je tugi skill lagi ski go skina we all ne hangas ni go ha elo he to go be no at led atlantic de years at led it long walk the go here Hattagias skinellana skistella naga skuia kohiga or lay hida. Oh, thank you all.
Wado, Yahweh. Thank you. Again, thank you, everyone. I will talk with Dr. Yellowbird about making his slides available in PDF format. We will reach out to you, and I did post the link to our YouTube archive in the chat. If you didn't catch that or are interested in having, we have all of our recorded events there. So this one included. Give us 5 to 7 days to get this recording downloaded and put into that archive. But it's a great way to review this event. So again, thank you, everyone. Until next time, we'll just say see you later. Tokcha.